morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian, and my very pleasant duty is to say, first of all, thank you to our speakers, to our panel, who will be talking about scholarly communications in the future, and especially to say thank you to the organizers of our now, I think, 13th Scholarly Communications Symposium. First of all, our co-chairs, William Olson from Lauder Library and Laura Bishop from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And of the other members of the committee, which is university-wide, and they include Jennifer Bocher from Lauder Library, Richard Brown from the Georgetown Press, Erin Kidwell from the Georgetown Law Center, Hannah Miller, also from the Georgetown Law Center Library, Janet Russell from Candles, Lisa Singh from the Department of Computer Science, and Morgan Stoddard, also from Georgetown Law. Thank you all very, very much. This has been a wonderful symposium series. We are aiming for people's greater understanding about the scholarly communications process. And with that, I will sit down to enjoy the rest of it and turn things over to co-chair Laura Bishop from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Laura.
Thank you, Artemis. Just a couple of brief housekeeping remarks, and then also I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning. We're very glad to have all of our panelists here. So a couple of things, there are two handouts. There is also a sign-in list if you'd like to be sure that you can be emailed. These symposiums happen each semester, and they're always fabulous. On the bottom of the handout, you can also share with your colleagues that this will be recorded and available online. So please direct people to the Lauder Library website where you can see some of the other really interesting programs that we've done over a number of years. Thank you very much. Carol Benedict, who will be our moderator this morning, is a professor of history at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of History, where she teaches modern China and world history. She did her undergraduate work at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and she has a master's and Ph.D. from Stanford University. She focuses her research on social and cultural history of the 19th and 20th century in China, with a particular focus on the social history of medicine and disease, women and gender history, and the history of Chinese consumer culture. And she has a number of very interesting publications, including about the bubonic plague, which you could be happy we didn't live through. The last remark I wanted to make is that Dr. Ranit Mishori is not able to be with us. She is an OB/GYN who is in the middle of delivering a baby. And so I was laughing with Bill that she's not only communicating scholarship to the next generation, she's delivering the next generation. She's very disappointed that she can't be here, but certainly a good reason. So I'll turn it over to Carol.
Well, first of all, let me thank Artemis and Laura and Bill Olson for having invited me to moderate this. This is a very interesting topic. I think the question of the relationship between disciplines and multidisciplinary learning. And the focus of the symposium this morning was based on two foundational questions that we were asked to think about before this morning. And these are briefly outlined on the handout that you have. The questions involve, first, that academic disciplines face theoretical and paradigmatic changes. These changes require reorientation of thinking about core ideas, concepts, and theories. And we were asked to think about giving examples of change and to describe how scholars and educators in our own disciplines are integrating their thinking, writing, teaching, and communication. And secondarily, going to the question of interdisciplinarity, we were asked to think about how university programs are increasingly being integrated into multidisciplinary programs and degrees, and how programs that require students to learn topics about social science and natural sciences, medicine, healthcare, and even the arts, all in one discipline, are doing this in the modern academy. And in the face of this kind of integration, how do scholars best communicate basic ideas, theory, and concepts regarding their home disciplines? Now, I'd like to take advantage of my prerogative as a historian to actually query the basic premise of our foundational questions, because underlying this notion is the idea that academic disciplines are enduring, that they are traditional, and that interdisciplinary or multidisciplinarity is somehow something that's quite new. And as the speakers come and talk about these questions from their own perspective, I would ask you to ponder to what extent are these assumptions true? Is it actually the case that traditional academic disciplines perpetuate themselves? Is this true? Or are academic disciplines always in a state of flux and transformation? If we think back, again, from a historical perspective, much of what we take for granted in terms of modern disciplines actually are fairly recent, right? So anthropology emerged in the 19th century, as did sociology. The American Political Science Association was established in 1903. Education came about in the early 20th century as a discipline. Psychology, of course, came about also in the early 20th century. So again, I'd ask us to think about whether or not it's true that there's such a thing as traditional disciplines versus interdisciplinary approaches. I would also ask us to think about whether or not interdisciplinarity is something new, right? Because again, I think knowledge has always been created at the edges and on the borders, and that's exactly how academic inquiry proceeds. And finally, I'd ask us to think about whether or not disciplines are actually the kind of silos that we think of them as, or if there isn't always a kind of fusion of disciplinary knowledge that's constantly being circulated across the disciplines. So these are just some of the things I was thinking about in relationship to the foundational questions. I'm sure that the speakers will have their own perspectives on these issues. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers. Each of them will speak for about 12, 15 minutes or so. And following that, we will have a few questions, and then the next speaker will proceed. And at the end, hopefully, we'll have a free-flowing back and forth discussion of the issues and ideas that have come forward. So the first speaker is Jeff Collmann, Ph.D., who's a professor on the research track in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology here at Georgetown in the University Medical Center. He currently works with the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research, building multidisciplinary research projects on complex socio-technical problems to employ Avis Terra, a high-performance computing capability. He obtained his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Adelaide, South Australia. His research focuses on understanding the effect of bureaucracy and other complex forms of organization on everyday life. The results of his research on social change among Australian Aborigines have been published in numerous articles and as a book, Fringe Dwellers and Welfare: The Aboriginal Response to Bureaucracy. He joined the ISIS Center, Department of Radiology in Georgetown in January of 1992, where he developed a national reputation in the area of assuring organizational compliance with health information security regulations, including work on HIPAA security program for the military health system. He helped found the project Argus, an award-winning biosurveillance program, and he teaches courses on biodefense, infectious disease, and Australian Aboriginal culture. How's that for introduction? Okay, with no further ado, I welcome Jeff.
Well, thank you, Carol. And I must say that having the pleasure of being with you 2 times in the same week, but having never met you in the 20-odd years I've been here before, is really strange. But yes, my answer to these foundational questions is that they define my life here at Georgetown. I have been in the medical center my entire time and have moved variously from being an administrator to being a researcher and a teacher. Always at the edges, always in the boundaries, always in that interstitial space between anthropology, microbiology, radiology, etc. And I have learned to thrive there, but that is almost the definition of what an anthropologist does. That's where you I can't imagine anything a little more weird, especially to the colleagues I grew up with, my boyhood friends. I grew up in East Tennessee, in the mountains of Tennessee, and I end up in the outback of Australia with my wife and 9-month-old baby living in a fringe camp in Alice Springs. And the first thing I noticed was that music is everywhere. I grew up in East Tennessee. I hated country music. That's like heresy, right? It's like being Catholic. I discovered that when I became Catholic 10 years ago. So I totally disliked country music, and so what happens? I arrive in Alice Springs, and all the Aborigines love country music. They're cowboys. They identify with it. They can sing more of the songs than I can, and they spend a lot of their money on batteries to play the music. So that sort of postmodern interstitial world is sort of where we've been. This morning I was counting the years I've been in university teaching, and it's frightening. 44. And I reflected on that because I started one place and I'm in a completely different place. And I want to talk a little bit about that because at the heart of this is how is it that we communicate with our students? What is the relationship between us and the student and us and the material and the students? And so I'd like to throw out for your thought the idea that at the heart of teaching is maintaining a dynamic tension. And I want to focus on 3 elements of that dynamic tension that mean most to me, and reflect how I've changed in my own approach to teaching students who I could not assume from the beginning understood even why I was in the classroom. As an anthropologist teaching the anthropology and sociology of biodefense to microbiologists, I have to start with the assumption that they don't want to be there. That's a fair assumption, and it's a requirement. So I have to start there. So the question is, how do I succeed? And I think I have. At least my ratings would suggest I have. And it's not the only reason they come, that they're required. So I'm going to lay out 3 elements to this notion of dynamic tension in teaching. One, there is, I think, a dynamic tension between being teacher-centered and student-centered. And there's no doubt in my mind that 44 years ago, I was teacher-centered. Absolutely, I thought the classroom revolved around me and what I knew. Second kind of tension that I think is important is content versus method. I'm quite certain that 44 years ago, I thought the only thing that I was supposed to do was deliver content. And that's because it was teacher-centered and it's what I knew, so I was supposed to deliver what I knew. And then finally, a really key tension, I think, is theory versus facts, to put it crudely. And I was quite convinced that I was there to teach facts. Now, what I'm not going to say to you today is that it's shifted entirely the other direction. That would be completely wrong. What I think makes especially interdisciplinary teaching hard is that you have to maintain that tension between being teacher-centered and student-centered, between being content and method, and between theory and fact. I do believe, for example, one of the things I had to learn to effectively teach in the microbiology department is where my students were going. Where were they going? They were graduate students. They were paying $40,000 to $50,000 a year. They had some very concrete professional goals that they wanted to achieve. Where were they going? Now, I was convinced that my class in the bureaucracy, in understanding the work environment to which they were headed, was vital to their career success. They were not. I had to somehow reach out and grab them. So it couldn't be all about me. It had to be about them. But if it wasn't a little bit about me, then I had no business being there, right? There is something to be said for experience in the bureaucracy. And I've had it. I've worked, and as a friend of mine said, in the bowels of the beast in the military health system. It's not like I just teach this stuff theoretically. Like most university professors here at Georgetown, we have this wonderful opportunity to work in this great bureaucracy. And for a bureaucratic anthropologist, you're never out of the field. I don't have to go to the field. I'm here all the time. And so there's an interesting balance there because you can get all caught up in anecdotes. People really don't want to hear about you, yet nonetheless, somehow or another, all those years working with the military, working with the intelligence community, somehow that should figure into the way I structure a course that is nonetheless student-centered. So I had to learn that. I had to learn how to understand what the students needed, and bring everything that I had in my 44 years of teaching and all my research on the Aborigines and on the military health system and the intelligence community, to bring all that to bear somehow and help them understand, yes, 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 it's relevant, it's pertinent to where I'm headed. So I summarize it with a phrase: bureaucracy protects us from biothreats, not just vaccines. And I spent the whole semester teaching to that aphorism, if you will. Content versus method. This, I think, is one of the toughest tensions to maintain. Because on the one hand, it's the content that hooks people. I mean, I can't just teach anything in a biodefense class, right? It has to be about biodefense. But the question is, what is it that they are learning when they are learning about biodefense? Well, I teach smallpox, I teach SARS, I teach the flu, but I also teach the shoot down of 2 U.S. helicopters by 2 U.S. Air Force jets over northern Iraq in Operation Provide Comfort, because what they really need to understand is how organizations work or don't work, how the most effective organizations in the world don't work from time to time. But there is a method there. There's a method of thinking, and so the whole course really is about how do we read these texts? Theory versus facts. Without theory, we don't understand anything. But that's not the normal mantra. But without facts, theory is abstract and useless. So in the teaching, I teach lots and lots of case studies, and I talk to students. We work in the class about how working up case studies gets you to more deeper understandings that you can take with you from northern Iraq to the Department of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So that tension, those tensions. My point here is that it's neither one nor the other. It is maintaining and negotiating that tension. Fine. What time did I start, Carol? 5 more minutes, okay. Now I want to talk about technology, because of course everybody is all about technology and the latest technologies, and I've been as interested as anybody, especially in some of the more, I've been teaching one of the first online classes in Georgetown ever. I teach my biodefense class online as well as live, and I've been using lecture capture as part of my Blackboard presentation ever since. So I've been interested in technology, but I really want to say that technology fundamentally is about 3 kinds of encounters. Pardon me, about 3s. It's something about being in a Catholic institution. It gives you 3s. So one is encounter with the text, which for an anthropologist is the heart and soul of teaching. 2, encounter with the phenomenon, whatever it might be. And 3, encounter with the learning context. More than anything, when my students finish the class, I want them to have encountered texts. I want them to understand that texts unlock so much. Now, the texts that I have them read range from the most boring policies on biodefense you could ever imagine, policies which are foundational to organizations, but are written in turgid, awful, usually the past tense. One of the tricks of teaching this class is undoing this tendency for the past tense. But the encounter with the text, and so I start with texts that are stories. I got this great book about the smallpox campaign, eradicating smallpox. Totally narrative, but embedded in it are ideas. And so we peer through the narrative to seek out, pull out the ideas, and I have rubrics and approaches to help them do that. At the end, we're dealing with very sophisticated anthropological and sociological texts with formal methodologies and layers of analysis and multiple kinds of theories and ideas and concepts. And the semester moves from the narrative to the analytic, and at the end, it's all kind of together. But this encounter with the text remains vital And for students in microbiology, for whom a text usually is 4 pages long, or some kind of boiled down textbook, it's a different kind of experience. And in the end, after 10 years of trying, it's working, I think. What about encounter with the phenomenon? Now, as an anthropologist, fieldwork is the heart of what we do. So the encounter with the phenomenon is essential. So how do you do that sitting here and talking about Australia, or for that matter, the Defense Intelligence Agency? Well, over the years, I've adopted all the kinds of things that you all have, documentary and feature films. In the last few years, I've been playing with in-class simulations, and I've gotten them more and more and more embedded in the class. These last 3 years, I've divided the students, I've assigned each student a biodefense agency. And they have to go out and research that agency, but then they have to be in these interagency project teams and sort of come up with some kind of plan to protect us against murders or this or that. So they learn, they become, I encourage them to become a member of that agency. And I encourage them to find an agency they want to work in so that they begin to learn out how to find out about it. Of course, service learning is big here. Fieldwork exercises. In my class on the anthropology of infectious disease, been very concerned about the HIV epidemic here in DC, and students have actually gone out and gathered data for themselves on different issues there. And then I've even had students work in internships on sexually transmitted diseases around here. All of this has to do with the encounter with the phenomena, and the problem with this, of course, is that it's unstructured and it's out of my control. That encounter is something that the students make or break. I'm not controlling that encounter. Encounter with the learning context. Well, the learning context is the classroom, we think. But now it's also online. And here, I'm afraid, being 65 has its limitations. If I were 55, I would truly, deeply try to learn how to not just use the online tools that Candles is making available, but to think through them. I know how to think through a book. I know how to think through a documentary film. I do not yet know how to think through online instructions. So in essence, my online courses are little better than attempts to take my live course and put it on. Now, I think I'm the only person in the program who actually uses the narrative, the Echo 360, but I've been doing that since the beginning because the idea of just putting PowerPoints up just didn't appeal to me, just failed. And the key to this one, and this I think is the challenge that remains for us, and I've seen it when I was working with the military health system. I saw so many enlisted men in the services who would be working at 2 o'clock in the morning listening to some course somewhere so they could get their bachelor's degree and become officers. Now these were guys with families, a full-time job, and they were going to school at night through online teaching. That experience convinced me that whatever else we say about it, we must do it because that segment of the population is growing and those people have the right to realize their professional ambitions as people. So the adult learner population is forcing us to think differently. So in essence, that's my story. That's how I would summarize my 44 years of teaching. I started out very teacher-centered. I was very content-centered, and I thought that really I was communicating facts. At this point in my life, I use any method I can to try to maintain some kind of dynamic tension between students, where they're headed and where I'm headed, between content and method. Truly the method is what people take with them and use somewhere else, and theory versus facts. How to generate theory out of facts, what's the relationship between theory and facts, all of those things are critical. And I think those, if I can sustain and move that tension from the beginning to the end of a course, I feel I would have communicated what I believe, and I believe I will have drawn them in. If I were to poll, I would fail. I think I must maintain that dynamic tension in order for the classroom to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. That was very interesting. I mean, I think the two elements that you were really honing in on are how does one communicate how does one conduct scholarly communication across the generations, because you're focusing on transmitting knowledge to the new generation that's coming, and also this question of how does one do that within this rapidly changing technological environment, and perhaps some of us are more adept at that than others. Are there any questions for Jeff from the floor?
Sorry. Shouldn't have sat down quite. I will not be insulted if you do not have any questions. We do want to hear from everybody else. We'll wait till the panel.
Okay. All right. So our next speaker is George Shambaugh from the School of Foreign Service and also Government Department. He is an associate professor of international affairs and government, as I said, in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and the former chair of the Department of Government at Georgetown. He received his B.A. in government and physics from Oberlin College, and an M.I.A. in international affairs, and a Master's of Philosophy and Ph.D. in political science from Columbia University. His research and teaching focus on topics of international politics, foreign policy, international political economy, and the environment. He's the author of many books, including States, Firms, and Power, Successful Sanctions in U.S. Foreign Policy, and co-author of The Art of Policymaking, Tools, Techniques, and Processes in the Modern Executive Branch, and co-editor of several volumes, and the author of many articles in various international affairs journals. And he's received many grants and awards. So with no further ado, let's welcome George.
I'd like to start off by saying two things. First of all, thank you for organizing this. It's a pleasure to speak. Second, it's always embarrassing to speak after someone who speaks extraordinarily well. you set the bar very high. And actually, in response to what you said, I want to shift what my comments were going to be a little bit. And I want to focus on this question of paradigm shifts and multidisciplinarity from the researcher and teacher perspective. I'll tie this to students because I think that's critically important, but the interesting thing I find about students is they are very adaptable, and indeed more adaptable than many of us become in time. And so in some ways, I'm less afraid of that. And what I see is more attention, and attention that has to do with research, attention that has to do with teaching, and attention that has to do with how you engage in multidisciplinary activity within a discipline when things change, and between disciplines. I've had the privilege to work on several multidisciplinary projects with people in psychology and psychiatry, and found that to be really an extraordinary experience. And I want to talk about that as an example of cross-disciplinary work. But before going there, I want to talk about paradigm shifts within political science. And to start with, if you think about paradigm shifts in political science, there was a big paradigm shift in our field that took place in the mid-1960s, early 1970s. It was a rise of behavioral approaches to the study of political science. It was to make the study of government and politics into the science of politics by applying new methods and new strategies in doing this. The interesting thing to me about that is there was a bit of a backlash that came about when I was beginning to go to graduate school in the early 1990s, now back towards more sociological approaches and other kind of broader dynamics, which in the discipline we call constructivism. But those two groups exist simultaneously, and indeed the Department of Government at Georgetown is called the Department of Government, not Department of Political Science, in large part because they bucked the behavioral revolution and thought that it was actually potentially a bad turn in the field. The Department of Politics at Princeton is the same way. If you look around the country, you'll see that you do have political science departments, you have Department of Politics, etc. Those names actually mean something. They may not apply to the people who are there today, but they apply to the people who were there in the 1960s who saw these changes coming. And they really speak to this question of what happens when you get when you get paradigmatic changes, when you get methodological changes. And in part there, I want to pick up on something you said, which is, I think those two things are different. I think there are theoretical paradigmatic changes in terms of dominant theories about the way the world works and how you explain that. There are also, in parallel, evolutions in methodology and the research techniques that are used to analyze these particular phenomena. Sometimes those intersect, sometimes they don't, but those two tensions go on simultaneously. And indeed, in the multidisciplinary work that I've done, I have found that the paradigmatic differences persist. That it is much harder to get people to ask across different disciplines or across different schools of thought within the particular discipline. It is much harder to get people that share different paradigmatic worldviews to ask similar questions, or indeed to value the questions that the other asks. It is much easier, and the synergy of collaboration is much, much more likely when, despite those paradigmatic viewpoints, they share a commonality in terms of research method. They share underlying principles in terms of evolution of methodology. And indeed, that evolution of methodology is what a lot of my work is in political economy. It bridges economics and political science. This one behavioral revolution dimension of political science is really converged substantially with economics. It's converged substantially with economics over the last 20 years, not so much in terms of the substantive paradigmatic big questions it asks, but rather in terms of the empirical statistical techniques, in terms of the modeling strategies, in terms of the basic research methodologies that are used to answer the questions we ask. And indeed, what I find if you go to a conference is a lot of the discussion, because of that, when you're dealing with multidisciplinary units, because I don't necessarily know or share the same questions you do, because I'm not actually familiar with all the literature you are, my questions are going to hinge on and focus on common methodological issues. So I understand what you did in the field. I understand what you did in a statistical sense. I understand what you did when you were trying to analyze and solve these problems. Your problems may be different from mine, but that understanding of the process and what research looks like, even if I'm not an expert in that area, gives me purchase. It gives me something that I can communicate with you. And that, I think, is profoundly important, because to me, that commonality of understanding research methods, again, even if it's not a method that I use, but understanding the basic principles of it really provide a bridge. And it gets back to what we teach our students. To me, there's always this tension of substance versus method. But I also, it's funny because I use references sometimes that they're not historical. They're only 20 years old, and the kids have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But it also dawned on me after that happened a couple times, not that I was getting older, but it dawned on me that actually what I teach them in terms of facts really do become outdated really quickly. What is much more important, especially knowing the world and the scholarly world as well as applied worlds are very dynamic, is not the substance. The substance is necessary. They need to have a historical foundation. They need to know something. They need to have some sort of frame of reference. It's always striking me when people talk about distances or populations in cities or something, and they really have no idea what it means to have a population of 500,000 people. Or whether you ask them how many people live in Washington, D.C., and it ranges from 250,000 to 5 million. And it's like, do you even know what that means? Like, without some sort of foundation in facts and evidence, theory is useless, method is useless. On the other hand, the real skill that I think matters most in terms of teaching these students is giving them the structure and the framework for thinking about different ideas, for analyzing things systematically. And not just in a monolithic way, but crossing disciplines, recognize what other disciplines bring to the table in that regard. So even if we don't talk the same language or ask the same questions in a broad sense, we can still learn from each other in terms of how to address these particular problems. When I did the collaborative work, I did a collaborative project on a National Science Foundation grant on responses to traumatic events. And the psychiatrists that we were working with were interested in who would be good first responders and who would be most vulnerable, and the impact of post-traumatic stress symptomology and whatnot. I was interested in how that affected political mobilization, political behavior, responsiveness to government policy and whatnot. I really liked my colleagues. They had no idea why that mattered, why the questions I asked mattered. And I thought what they did was sort of interesting, but really kind of beside the point. But the reality was that we shared an interest in the general topic, and we shared an interest in the methodology. We surveyed a lot of people. We interviewed a lot of people. We both benefited from the data that we collected. And in collecting that data, it gave us a common reference point. So I learned more about various aspects of post-traumatic stress symptomology than I ever knew before. Will I actually use it? No, but does it actually increase my understanding of the political, the social dynamics that I see? Absolutely it does. And do the methods that I learned in working with them help me? Yes. Is the reverse true? I hope so. So in some ways I see that as that's really the core. Now the other thing I learned though in that process is psychiatry, and maybe it's true about other hard sciences, I don't know, and social sciences, or at least political science, government, have very different research cultures. So in political science, your multi-authored work is really frowned upon. You have more than 2 authors and people are like, what are you doing? Are you kidding me? Well, that only works, we literally divide the credit per project by the number of contributors. So, you literally get half credit for something you co-author, you get a third credit, et cetera, all the way down. It's a huge disincentive to work with other people. And the idea that you would actually have a graduate student could do some things for you, but the idea that a graduate student would actually write something in a paper, or even worse, do the analytical analysis for you and give you the analysis and then you just write it out, that would not happen in political science. For my colleagues at Irvine, in the psychiatry program, they're like, oh no, actually we expect kind of 4 or 5 papers out of this. And I said, well, what have you done? Well, actually, I don't know how to do the statistics. I'm just going to run it. And my graduate students are going to do all the work. They're going to give it to me, and then I become the lead author, and then it goes in this kind of sequence of the next 5 people, and the one at the bottom is the one who got the grant. It's a whole different idea of what it meant to do research. I was thinking, that's actually really cool, but it doesn't translate, it doesn't fly. And the interesting thing is then, in writing the grant, we shared the idea, but then when it actually came to implementing it, there were a lot of cultural biases that we had to overcome. And they weren't cultural biases. My colleagues there are brilliant people. It's just that the whole research culture was fundamentally different in terms of what it meant to collaborate, what it meant to conduct research, et cetera. What tied us again together was the basic question. What tied us again together was the research and the mutual usefulness of sharing those methods and sharing the data. But there's certain things that never came in sync. And one of those was what the nature of collaborative work really was. Another one was really valuing the importance of the various pieces of this. So my name appears as 6th or 7th author on a few psychiatry things. It doesn't affect my career whatsoever. They opted not to even be included on the political science stuff. So we actually published in 2 completely different fields using the same body of research. We didn't do what we initially thought, which was all pool together and all write the same things and all publish the same articles. And this was a perfectly amicable thing, by the way. It turned out to be much better to do it separately. So that experience to me really highlights 2 things. One is that the methods and the commonality of interest in data really are a nice overlapping means of communication. They provide a nice overlapping means of developing collaborative work. But there are limits, and those limits have to do with paradigmatic views, and the paradigmatic views have to do with the questions you ask, the questions you think that are important, and sometimes really smart people are going to ask just fundamentally different questions, and you can work side by side with them, and you can share the data, be perfectly excited about it, but still not end up in the same place. And I think that's perfectly okay. but it's just a warning flag that I know there's a drive towards collaborative work. I like that, but there are limits to this. It also speaks to what we teach our students, and it says that teaching your students to be open-minded, flexible, adaptable, and good scholars, in a broad definition of that term, is more important, I think, than teaching them to be up on the most current political science literature or psychiatry literature or what have you. That they're likely to confront multiple questions and multiple problems. And the key thing to me about teaching is inspiration and really finding where the students get inspired. And it does not matter, if I have a really good student in my class, I don't care if they're a government major or political science major. I'd rather them just be excited about what they're doing and be able to say to them, look, I want you to pursue that interest, and maybe that means you should move over to the medical school, maybe that means you should go somewhere else. But regardless of what you do, you've got to do this systematically. You've got to know what a good research design looks like. You've got to know how to make an argument. You've got to know how to communicate this kind of general idea to a broad audience. You've got to know how to focus it down into something very narrow that you can analyze. So that's where the research component, I think, really does come into play. The last thing I wanted to say is just a few comments about technology. I love technology. And actually, I'm a little bit of a technological bug. I remember when this is an old iPhone, but I remember when it came out, I got comments at the end of the year saying he got an iPhone and he really likes it, which I didn't even realize. I must have been up in front of the class, like playing with this or using it as examples. But the most incredible thing about technology is that it's an extraordinarily good tool. And I see lots of potential, especially with data analysis. And it's not so much being able to analyze big swaths of data. It's being able to communicate it in a visual sense that allows people who are not statisticians to actually understand various phenomena. There's something called the digital globe that I think is just extraordinary. And it's extraordinary not because of not because of what it can do for you in a formal methodological sense, but what it can do for you in terms of presenting data to a broad general public. It basically is a sphere, and it can show on that sphere all sorts of dynamic interactions. So if you're interested in climate change or the flow of fish or the flow of airlines or pollution around the globe, you can watch it. And 2 minutes of watching that says more to most people in the room than an hour of standing in front of a chart walking through what's statistically significant and this and that. That visualization tells people what you're after. Then they can ask whatever questions they happen to be interested in. Then you can refine the tools and techniques to get them to answer the questions they want to go after. Then the psychiatrists and the political scientists, the historians in the room can begin to ask questions that they're interested in about those particular topics. So I see this data, the technology is a real tool, a real creative way of especially getting information to broad, multidisciplinary audiences. I am really not sold on online learning. I am really not convinced that this is the gold mine that people think it's going to be yet. I think we're in the beginning of that evolutionary process, and it hasn't evolved into an animal that is yet useful. Because, like, this is not a comment on you, but like you, I can see myself putting PowerPoints, being filmed, putting out a blog, doing whatever. That to me is not the same. That as doing something live. And I actually think it's dangerous. I think Georgetown has a real locational advantage. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I don't think that's going away. It's not to say that online learning isn't important. It is. But it isn't done yet. It isn't a finished animal. This is an evolving thing. And I think it's incumbent on us as we go forward and think about the future of learning to think about how to actually use this technology, not as a marvel, but really as something to expand pedagogy, to open communication across different fields, to really inspire people to move forward. So it has a huge potential for communication. I just right now don't. We're just not quite there yet. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't go into it, but it means I think we should go into it wide open and move ahead.
So I thought that was an excellent summary of where we are within the university. university, basically, that there's a lot more scholarly communication going on across disciplines than perhaps we often think. And yet at the same time, this kind of common notion of disciplines as silos perhaps does have continued resonance because, of course, there are cultures of disciplines that perhaps are difficult to break through due to professional standards, professional associations, of training, and so on. So I thought that was a very nice a way to encapsulate where we are in this problem. Are there any questions for George at this juncture?
George,
Yes.
what's the name of that software you were describing right at the end?
Oh, it's something called Digital Globe. And actually, if you, the New York Times, so the people who did this are selling it. But if you, if you Google New York, the New York Times did a really nice spread on it about 6 months ago, and it's really extraordinary. It's sort of, there's something called Gapminder, which is out there that allows you to put, map statistical things over time. And there are a whole variety of softwares now that use Google Earth as a platform. And this kind of merges those two things, because what Digital Globe allows you to do is, it's designed to look at the Earth as a whole. But you could look at images over time, so you can track, say, different chemicals in the atmosphere flowing around different things, or different temperatures in the oceans, or other things like that. But you can also superimpose on that population densities, regime type, wars or ongoing conflicts, migration patterns, financial flows. Literally,
Can they track missing planes?
yes, except I don't know how well it works when it goes underwater. But it's really extraordinary. And there's just potential all over the place. What you'll see if you look at the image is also, sorry for the digression, the people that do the Digital Globe were climate scientists. And the work they did is brilliant. The guy who does the presentation is the worst speaker I've ever seen, and is horrendously bad. And it actually speaks, this is not a criticism of him, but it speaks to the importance of communication, because the product is extraordinarily good. But I just ran the clip the other day in my classroom from that New York Times article about, it's either Digital Globe or Digital Earth. But I ran the clip. I turned off the sound because he will put you to sleep, but then can begin to talk about it. And it suggests to me, again, that how we present things really matter. And sometimes we're not the best spokespeople for what we actually do. We may be too close to it and too tied into the marvels of the technology to actually step back and realize actually what we need is somebody who can communicate far better than I can, and really kind of show some of the benefits of this to the broader world. Anyway, if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. But it's really an extraordinary technology, and it's just the beginning. I mean, the thing to me is all of these platforms are ways to present data. Everybody's talking about big data, this, big data, that. Data is not the issue. The issue is how to communicate this in a way that inspires sociologists, anthropologists, chemists, etc., to begin to ask questions they wouldn't have thought of before, whether they're us as academics or our students. And that's what I think it's just extraordinary.
Jenna?
Just a real quick one on, when you publish separately from, it sounded like maybe the NSF project, do you think something critical or juicy was lost that you guys didn't figure out how to do a joint publication?
You know, this was a behavioral and social, it's a branch of the NSF, behavioral and social sciences or something like that.
Economic sciences.
And economics, yeah. And the whole idea was collaborative work. So they really, really, really wanted us to do this collaborative thing, and I think we disappointed them. I know we disappointed them by not doing that. We did do collaborative work. We didn't do the collaborative publishing. Was something lost? You know, in the broad ideal, maybe, but actually I think the value added of that project was that we created a data set that we didn't have before, that the other political science collaborator and I actually published things we wouldn't have been able to publish otherwise, that the psychiatrists and psychologists published something they wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
Right.
Now, would it be, the ideal was that we'd bring our two disciplines together, we'd have this great nirvana moment. That's what didn't happen.
Right. Right.
But
When we
it
get to
could
the panel,
still.
I'm going to give you a counterexample.
Oh.
It still could. I still believe that this is possible. I don't think we made a mistake in doing it. I'm just sharing that as
Yeah.
just, and I don't think we failed.
Right.
Everybody on TV, we didn't fail. We still got the grant, we still published the articles. They just came out in different disciplines.
And perhaps more funding would help you.
But it was just interesting to me because I didn't think it would work that way. I thought we'd have some nirvana moment because I still think what they did was cool, and they still say they think what we did was cool. But it didn't come out in a single piece. I take it back. There was one collaborative piece, but that was really just descriptive. It was just talking about the data. It wasn't engaging cross-disciplinary ideas. It was just kind of, this is what we did.
So one observation that may or may not be true is that perhaps you reached more of an audience or a different audience than you would have reached if you published one single paper, because you published
Different,
for,
right.
for two disciplines who might not have read the other's work. So
Right, so for the NSF, and that's the pitch we gave them. So for the NSF, we actually got more citations than we'd have otherwise because we hit both disciplines and
I don't know.
yes. And again, I don't feel badly about it. It was actually a learning experience. And when we went into this with the NSF, their question and repeated questions throughout was, tell us about this experience, about the collaborative process. And again, it wasn't negative. It just didn't. We didn't get to a new nirvana, right? That's all.
Well, and I think it's a nice example too, because it's really freeing for the future of kind of interdisciplinary work. Because I think you do have that initial idea that if you don't publish one paper and it's all together, that it's a failure. And so to see that it was successful, both papers on their own, it lowers that initial cost. It doesn't feel overwhelming to think, okay, well, we have to follow this through to the end and have one vision and one goal. Like you said, you have this great piece of data that can be used for multiple things. You had some great papers that are published in multiple places. And so it kind of opens up the idea of what collaborative work could look like. So it doesn't all have to be just one paper or one thing. And I like that notion.
Very good. Thank you, George. All right, so our next speaker is Francis Slakey, who is the Upjohn Lecturer on Physics and Public Policy and co-director of Science in the Public Interest at Georgetown University, where he specializes in energy and security policy. He is also, interestingly, the author of the international best-selling adventure memoir, To the Last Breath. Dr. Slakey received his Ph.D. in physics in 1992 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His technical publications have received more than 500 citations. He's also written widely on science policy issues, publishing more than 50 articles for the popular press, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Scientific American. He served in advisory positions for a diverse set of organizations, including the National Geographic, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Creative Coalition. He is a fellow of the American Physics Society, a fellow in the American Academy of Advanced Sciences.
Close.
Okay. MacArthur Scholar and a Lemelson Research Associate of the Smithsonian Institution. He teaches 2 science and society courses each year at Georgetown, and the fall semester focuses on global challenges, with the spring semester focused on shaping U.S. national science policy.
So Carol mentioned that I wrote this adventure memoir. It's because I used to be a climber surfer. So is it all right if I just start off with a climbing story? So there's this climber, and he was climbing completely alone. And he slips off a ledge, and now he's dangling at the end of his safety line 1,000 feet above a ravine. And there is no way he can climb up the rope. There's no way he can swim to safety. So in complete desperation, he just calls out, "Can anybody help me?" And then suddenly the clouds part, and this beautiful light shines down from the heavens, and this voice booms out and says, "Yes, my son, I can help you. Take out your knife and cut the rope." So he takes out his knife and he holds it up to the rope and then he stops and he thinks, and he yells out, "Can anybody else help me?" So, Carol, thank you. So I teach 2 classes. I teach Shaping National Science Policy in the spring that's going on now, and that's when we focus on domestic issues. And then I teach Science and Society Global Challenges in the fall, and that's when I focus on global issues. But the classes work the same way. Students break into groups of their own choosing. They identify some pressing social issue, again, of their own choosing. And then they take advantage of the town, they go and find out what people are doing about those things, and then they develop a solution of their own. And I started teaching this way back in 2007, and since I started teaching this way, the students have been successful. Since 2007, 3 student groups have drafted legislation that has been passed by Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. I have students that have gone to Calcutta to work on their projects, students that have gone to Bamako, Mali to work on their projects, students are going this summer to work in Angola on their project, and in all cases they found funding to go ahead and do it. So, how does it all happen? I operate under 2 simple principles. One of them is think outside the textbook, get off campus. And the other is education doesn't stop at the end of a semester. Okay? So I want to give you an example of how all this works, but I feel like I should make a confession first, which is when I started teaching this way, I was a disaster. It took me a couple years to figure out how to do this, and if this audience cares at all, I'm happy to reflect on all the mistakes that I made before I eventually got it right. But I'm going to give you an example of when I finally did get it right, how it works. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to take you into my classroom. Okay? So this is the sort of thing that you would see if you walked into my classroom day 1. And you'll see how I set up a problem as a physicist who now works on global sustainability and science policy. Right? So let me start by actually taking the globe. Let's take the whole globe and let's put it on a graph. Let's put it on a science policy graph. So one axis is science, energy per capita, and the other will be our policy axis. Gross domestic product per capita. Now let's take the whole globe and let's put it on that graph. All right, so down here, Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, North America. That's actually, even though there's only 5 data points, that is a remarkably rich data set. What does that suggest to you? You look at that, what does that suggest to you? Well, what it suggests is that the more energy you burn, the richer you are. The more energy you burn, the richer you are. The more energy you burn, the richer you are. The more energy you burn, the richer you are. So hold that thought. And now for a moment, let's just focus on the 2 billion people who live down here. They are impoverished. They live on less than $2 a day. They suffer from diseases. They suffer from polio and cholera and malaria. You know why I picked those 3? All preventable. All preventable. We don't suffer from those up here, but they suffer from them by the millions. They die from those down here. And as a result of all of this, life expectancy down here is short. Right, so life expectancy up here is low 80s, high 70s. Life expectancy down here, low 50s. If I had the misfortune of being born in Sierra Leone, life expectancy, 47. Odds are I'd be dead by now. In fact, somebody woke up this morning in this part of the world and walked 7 miles just to get clean water. Dust kicking up from their feet, walking that hard path in life, desperately hard path in life. So let's think for a moment about what we might be able to do to make that path just a little bit easier. So let's suppose we set a modest goal for ourselves. And the goal is to lift this region of the world up out of poverty. Now I set a modest goal, all right? So let's not try to set a goal of trying to lift this region of the world up out of poverty to match the developed world. It'd be just way too ambitious, right? Not even halfway. Let's suppose we just have the modest goal of trying to lift this part of the world up 1/3 on this graph. Okay. That means deploying electricity, building roads, building clinics, and pumping stations. Okay? Suppose we committed to doing all of that. Okay? And we did it in the same way that the developed world does, with the same mixture of energy, same mixture of petroleum and natural gas and coal. All right, great. So now let me ask a physics question. This is an energy graph, right? Well, how much energy would it take to do what I just described? Okay, well, you can integrate under the curve. You can do that calculation. You can figure out how much energy would be required to do what I just said. Lift this part of the world up 1/3 on the graph. And the answer is 160 quadrillion BTUs. What does that mean? Let me tell you what it means. Now remember, again, I'm saying if this is done the exact same way that we do it in the developed world, if we build those roads, we deploy electricity, we build clinics and pumping stations, and we do it all with the same mixture of petroleum and coal and natural gas, here's what that energy required means. Here's what 160 quadrillion BTUs means. It means another 5 billion barrels of oil burned every year. It means another 150 coal plants, another 120 natural gas plants. It means 130 billion tons of carbon emissions. Uh-oh. Whoa. I mean, think about that. What I just described has a huge negative environmental consequence. So what do we do? What do we do? I mean, if lifting this region of the world up out of poverty risks irreversible climate change, what do we do? So here's one solution. We turn to this part of the world and we say, oh, I'm sorry. You know, helping you out risks environmental damage, so you just got to take it for the team and just stay down here and suffer. All right, so that's unacceptable. But there is another solution. And it's bend the curve. Stop thinking that the only path to prosperity lies in burning more energy. Bend the curve. Find ways. We have to find ways to allow economies to grow without increasing the energy intensity. And oh, by the way, not just down here, we got to do it up here, and we got to do it up here too. Now, if you were in my class, this is about the time I'd stop talking. And I'd turn to the students, and they take over. So let me give you an example of a student group that took over at this point, okay? Actually, I'm going to grab something to drink here. So they got particularly concerned with what's going on in this region of the world. And they were asking themselves, okay, how do we enable economic growth while at the same time keeping energy use constant? And they became enamored with this particular technology, bus rapid transit, or method, which is dedicated bus lane where the buses move at high frequency. Okay? So they, oh, incidentally, I teach science majors. So this was a group of science majors. And they create a mathematical model to figure where in Africa could you actually deploy bus rapid transit to have the biggest impact. And they had a number of inputs to their mathematical model. They had population growth, current population, current car ownership, concentration of jobs in parts of the city. So they created a mathematical model, entered data in from all around Africa, and what popped out was Bamako, Mali. Okay? So it was possible that Bamako, Mali could benefit from bus rapid transit. So for the rest of the semester, they talked to experts, and by the end of the semester came to the conclusion that, yeah, there might be actually some merit in deploying bus rapid transit in Mali. So I like to give interesting finals to the students. So in their case, I said, okay, well, it's interesting what you came up with. Now, for your final, what you have to do is go out into the city, talk to some foundation, and ask them for money so that you could go to Bamako, Mali to do a feasibility study. Okay, not that I expected them to get the money, it's just, you go and ask somebody for money and suddenly the questions get really hard, harder than I could ever think of. So off they went, and they got the money. So, spring break, the next semester, they continued to work on it, so this is no longer in the classroom, they just became impassioned by the project on their own, continued to work on it, and then they went to Mali in spring break. And went to the streets of Bamako, they counted traffic, they did measurements, and they came to a conclusion that there's this one strip, about a 5-kilometer strip, where you could lay down bus rapid transit. Now, before they'd left, they had made an appointment with the Minister of Transportation in Mali. And so they finished their work, they went to see the minister, and they explained it all. And they said, look, this is feasible, here are the benefits. And the minister said, well, thanks. We're not really concerned about that right now. We have other concerns. In fact, and he schooled the students. So let me tell you what the top 5 concerns are for us in Mali right now. Number 1, public health. Number 2, education. Number 3, public health. Number 4, public health. Number 5, public health. Okay, so now step back a minute. What's that mean? I mean, does that mean this is hopeless? Does that mean we can't bend the curve? Right? That this part of the world is going to continue going the way they're going. They can't be bothered with this problem right now. Well, I think this is when the education really began for these students. And they said to the minister, so you're concerned about public health, where are you planning to put in sewage lines? And so he rolled out a map of where they were planning to lay sewage lines and said, you know what you could do? When you repave, you're going to tear up all the road right here. When you repave it, you could lay in a bus rapid transit line. Okay? So what's the lesson there, right? The lesson was, if we want to get to this region of the world to be concerned about this problem, in order for them to flatten the curve, it has to be in their interests, not in our interests. And that lesson was one that I had mentioned in class, but they didn't learn it until 3 months later. Okay. And that's what I mean when I say education doesn't stop at the end of the semester. And I hope the example demonstrated, think outside the textbook, get off the campus. But let me make a couple final summary points, which is what I just described as a physics class. This is listed as a physics class and a biology class. So I lie outside the discipline, but I will say I value the discipline because I need those students to know basic physics, know basic biology, think like a scientist when they walk into my classroom. And in fact, it takes the same analytic skills that you need to solve the block on the inclined plane, the classic problem in physics, as it does to create a mathematical model to figure out where to deploy bus rapid transit to have maximum effect in Africa. Same analytic skills, just a different type of problem. And then one final thing is, which may be apparent, I mean, to me, a science student, when inspired by a sense of social purpose, can become one of the most powerful tools we have to build a better world. But science alone isn't enough. Science alone is not enough. So let me tell you what I'm doing next fall with the class. So next fall, I put out a query to business school students and said, send a cover letter, send me your resume if you're interested in taking this class. And I've now selected 5 of them who will be in the class with the science majors. We've also got grad students in human development who will be taking the class. And so they will be true interdisciplinary teams now that are going to be working on the problems. And in terms of the professors, it's not just me. Starting next semester will also be Bill Novelli from Global Social Enterprise Initiative in the business school, and Sonal Shah, who just took over as the head of the Beck Center for Social Development. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
A wonderful example of interdisciplinary at work with profound real-world fact that I, as a historian, didn't know that the American Association for Advancement of Sciences is AAAS, and I thought it was Asian Studies or something. Shows the kind of, again, the silo. But anyway, any questions for? All right, George?
So one of the things I find striking about your example is the link between science and policy and the receptiveness of the people they went to actually fund these projects. And the question is, did they go to those public organizations, private organizations, NGOs? I mean, have you found a difference in receptivity to this sort of thing in different genres outside of academia or different sectors?
So yeah, at the end of last semester, student groups, I mean, I picked one, but at the end of the last semester, groups pitched to a number of different organizations. One pitched to ExxonMobil, and in fact, they're getting support from ExxonMobil to go to Angola to work on that project, which I'll just say briefly, their idea, which is going to sound wacky, was to promote sustainable farming in Angola by setting up a revolving loan fund supported by ExxonMobil. Right? I mean, there's good reasons for everything they chose there, but when they did the pitch to Exxon was intrigued and helped support their going to Angola. Another pitch to Coca-Cola, another pitch to Lounsbury Foundation. So it's a mixture. It's a mixture of groups that they go to, and there was a lot of receptivity to the ideas that they had. I'll stay here.
Do you want to join?
I will. Okay, so 3 very stimulating presentations, I think, on where we are in terms of scholarly communication, paradigm shifts, the connections between disciplines, the siloing of disciplines. You had said you had an example of a counterexample?
We've also got a grant, and we're working on it now from NSF. It's part of the, it's called Building Community and Capacity between social scientists and computational scientists in the use of big data. And we got it to study a problem in forced migration. We're trying to develop a forecasting model to tell NGOs and governments what are the conditions under which people will move in a forced way, where they go, how many will go, what the pattern will be, and so forth. And necessarily includes people who understand migration deeply, but we're also using our big data sources, something we built here at Georgetown called Raptor, which is a huge archive of 600,000 essentially newspaper articles in a whole 46 languages, 200, so forth. And, but it includes computational scientists. Lisa Singh is one. We have this absolutely crazy computer scientist who spent most of his life at Lawrence living out at Raytheon and NSA, ontologist. And we worked very hard on this building community piece because that's what NSF has wanted. And we've learned that there are points where there's articulation and points where there's separation. And I think the only part of what you said that I disagree with is that I think there are points of articulation where joint publishing is possible. And we are presenting 6 papers at international meetings this summer demonstrating this. But I think the issue is not the intellectual problem as much as the credit one, the professional problems that say, this issue of how many authors are on a paper sounds about as stupid as it gets. But it is not, I mean, for example, I think at the law school, the only thing that counts is a single author paper in a law review, that sort of thing. The idea of team research is almost antithetical. But in order for us to get the work done that we're doing in this thing, we have got to publish together. Or NSF will say, well, we're not going to give you the implementation. I've also, we just had in an HIV study that we've done here, we're collaborating. I'm an anthropologist. The other people in the study are medical doctors, statisticians, computer scientists, working with the WISE database. We just had a paper accepted at the International AIDS Convention. there's going to be like 12 authors. Well, that's not going to do me any good. But what I think really matters is that the activity is happening, the knowledge is being produced, and publications are coming out. I think so. I think that part of what has to change is the environment within which we work. As long as the incentives stay the same, as long as the structures stay the same, as long as the career paths stay the same, then you're absolutely correct. But I think there has to be some pioneering there where people say, well, the hell with it, I'm just going to go forward.
Well, I consider that issue of multiple authors. So in physics, you guys all familiar with the Higgs boson? So the actual paper that appeared announcing the Higgs boson had 1,000 authors. So I can calculate that out, George. So in your department, you get 0.1% credit for actually being an author.
Yeah, exactly right. But there's a lot of energy that went into it. I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things the disciplines, at least the social science disciplines, are facing is really adapting to this. And there are some aspects of the field that are more adaptive than others, and they tend to be those that are focused on data analysis and other things, where you can actually divide labor and it makes sense. But there are other aspects of political science, particularly where division of labor, it's not obvious what other people would do, or how that would be divided. So I think it's a real tension. The other thing I would say is we also have these strange biases in terms of not just the number of authors, but where you publish. And, oh, if you're going to get tenure or promoted or whatever, you need to publish in this, and this journal. And it's like, well, one of the articles that came out of this project was published in JAMA. Well, great,
yeah.
But does it matter for political science at all? No. They're like, well, who cares? It's just not relevant. And it's not, so I didn't mind being a 15th author, I did whatever on that one, because really it actually made no difference. But so it was a question partly of saying, how do we do this? But it was also, well, okay, of course we're going to publish here. It's like, well, no, actually, we're going to publish over here. And then we're like, well, international organization, American Political Science Review, you know what? Go for it. It really is not going to help us at all. So it's a real tension.
So one thing I was going to say is, with all of the work that you all do, in all of your disciplines, whether they be silo-based or interdisciplinary, you cannot do any of this without, of course, libraries. There is truth to be found in libraries, and so those of you who are talking about facts versus theory or multiple approaches to problems can find lots of answers here, not just here physically. But another thing that has been elicited from the comments that you're making about publications, to bring it closer to the academy here, is that libraries and publishers are working together to think about ways of defining different modes of publication, just as you're looking at different modes of teaching and dealing with technology. The open access movement, for example, is encouraging people to publish in interdisciplinary ways, not just relying on the sort of standard journals or monographic publishers in your respective fields, but looking at different models, which then goes to talking to tenure committees and the academy in general to say, there are new methodologies, there are new things coming along, and they're all good and valid and peer-reviewed and useful for your respective disciplines. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
I think your point's correct. And one way of understanding this too, though, is to see that there'll be different points in an individual's career when it is okay or not okay to engage them in these kinds of activities. So in the work that I do out of the Office of the Senior Vice President, I'm constantly looking for people with technical skills that can be engaged with respect to the different problems that we have. But one category of people that I leave alone, I sort of say, hi, here we're doing this, and when you get tenure, I'll be back, is the tenure track assistant professor is on a clock, and you just have to respect that. I think once you get tenure, your world opens up. Of course, then some people will say, well, I will never get to the full professor, which I don't think is true. I think you can move forward. But I worry about the issue of currency. It does matter to publish in JAMA. I'd love to publish in JAMA. Larry Gostick publishes in JAMA all the time. He has a weekly column there, actually. And one of the great things about Larry is that he shares that with a lot of other people, young, up-and-coming legal scholars, people who are interested in law and public health kind of thing. But these same problems that George is talking about affect new interdisciplinary journals, new online journals. People don't give them the same currency that, so you have to take a risk. You know, there have to be people who say at different points in their lives, well, you know, if we're going to move forward on this, I have to take a risk. I have to be willing to publish with infectious disease doctors. I have to be willing to publish with computer scientists. I have to be willing to be 15th on a computer science article, as long as they'll be 15th on in the Journal of the American Anthropology Society. You know, so there's some trade-offs here, and I think it's really not the intellectual problems, it is the professional problems that get in our way.
Yeah, I was going to say, from the historian's perspective, history has always been a multidisciplinary discipline. It's always changing. The paradigm shifts are constant and continual. You know, history, as it's written now, is very different as it was, 50 years ago. But what has been maintained, probably since Herodotus, is the professional convention that the historian is the single workman at the bench producing historical writing, and that has not changed. So even as technology and in your world, the library changes, the notion that a historian must produce a single authored monographed scholarly work continues, and there's great resistance to any other form, for professional development. I'm sure that's true in the other disciplines as well. That's where the real conflict, as George pointed out in his comments, the real conflict is not between different disciplines sharing knowledge, methodologies, research, and so on. It's really this kind of professional siloing, I think, that we're in.
I'd like to comment. I think I underutilize the library. So if you're willing, let's meet. I can meet with you and your staff. Let's think about how we can make better use of it in the classroom.
I use it, but I use it on my desk. I don't have to come down here, which is a great, since my desk is at 2115 Wisconsin.
And just remember that what's on your desk is vended to you by the library.
That's exactly right.
Janet?
So I'm wondering if you guys could talk about how, or any of you, I think, could talk about how the digital might help address all of this. Like, we still get to publish in the journals that have currency and get us tenure promotion, but can somehow extract things and do other kinds of public. I mean, it sounded like even Digital Globe, in a way, is a digital publishing platform where some of this could come together. So I don't really know.
Well, one thing is, I can't imagine teaching without the World Wide Web anymore. There used to be, and there still is, I guess, a government repository here in the library. But
Or
it's not-
online, or both.
Yeah, but the online repository for the government is enormous. And so obtaining that information, again, I can do it at my desk. I can prepare my class at my desk, pull it off, grants.gov, or whatever it is that I want. And I can't imagine teaching my class in bureaucracy of biodefense without access to.
But Joe, can you imagine someone remixing and publishing so that we have the nirvana moment of people? Yeah.
So I think that the digitization is, it's got a good side and a bad side. The good side is, I developed this NSF project because we were sitting together at a conference talking about things, and I got to know these people that way. But having gotten to know them, we could continue our work in different parts of the world. We just convened a couple times throughout the project physically, but the digitization enabled that much more than just email. And it isn't just because we could get our data online, we did all sorts of things in a collaborative sense. So in that way, digitization is great. The biggest issue I have, though, with digitization comes back to the library, which is, to me, it's a question of property rights. And I'm not exactly, it's property rights and evaluating what you do in a digital world, because the question of property, the whole intellectual property regime is totally outdated. I mean, you might fight it, but the reality is the law just doesn't match the reality anymore.
Absolutely.
And it's going to fundamentally shift in the next next 10 or 20 years. I mean, the audio business, the music business and the theater business and movies, they're just decades ahead of us, but it's all coming. And that's radically transforming publishing. I mean, we were just sharing with somebody, you're sharing a story about that earlier today. To the extent that publishing a physical book, I think in 10 years' time is going to be very difficult to do. And what it means to publish a book is going to be fundamentally different because you're going to want online content, which is going to actually make us into something we're not. And that to me is kind of, that's transformative. But the other thing is now, every time I just got back from 2 conferences, and I submitted the conference paper, and that conference paper is now automatically online, which means it's not published yet. They put a little copyright designation, it was written for whatever, but the data, but it's out there, right? Already the information is disseminated. What does that mean? That means actually somebody else in my field, if they're faster than I am at it, could pick up on it, take a piece of it, and publish it somewhere before I did. I'm not particularly worried about that, because luckily I have tenure. But it's a reality, right? And in a way, it's a way, all of these online depositories are great because you can Google it and find it really fast, and I can do a lot of research and find working papers galore, and that enhances scholarship and interaction and all the rest. But it also means that notion of intellectual property is basically gone because that idea is now out there. So you don't have to wait for it to come out in the journal a year from now. It's already out there. And so exactly what the value, the journal means it's going to be vetted, it'll be better, right? And it's going to have, it's be doubly blind reviewed, but you know what, that's kind of silly because it's been out there, so if anybody wanted to find it, they could find it. So in other words, this digitization is transforming our whole business. And exactly what that's going to mean to me is really not obvious.
From the humanities point of view, digital humanities, of course, is making it, providing very powerful tools for teaching, allowing us to get away from what I just said, which was the single authored monograph model of scholarship, and instead model for students how to do digital projects of mapping, all kinds of wonderful things. So that, I think, is a real boon for humanities.
Can I pick up on that?
Sure.
And this is, you're familiar with this, Jen. So, yeah, there is a real digital advantage to be had in the classroom. I agree completely. And so a couple years ago, working with Janet, we came up with this thing called Global Solver, which would enable students in my class not just to tap the expertise of people in DC, but go worldwide. So if we could build up a cohort of experts around the world, they could be on Global Solver, students could load up ideas and test it out. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this story, but there's a student, he made news. He was the first student to ever come up with a wiki bill. And he came up with an idea, loaded it onto a site, experts went in on it, went on the site, tinkered with the bill, and kept getting involved, and then eventually took it to Congress and got it introduced. His name is Derek Stace Naughton. The bill was for screening bleeding disorders, and it was done with the tool that Janet helped develop called Global Solver. And thanks to Karma, we have the Viney Foundation coming on the 29th to take a look at this to see whether it's scalable. Yeah. So yes, there's a real advantage. And for me, it's enabling the students to tap a world of experts, not just the experts that are local.
Please.
Aaron K. Brown, Curator of Legal History Collections at the Law Library, in their digitization initiatives and special collections department. And I take your copyright intellectual property concerns seriously, but there's another side to the digitization coin and the digital humanities coin. So I work with law and history, law and literature, jurisprudence. I was interested in this symposium because I also have run into these inabilities to communicate between the disciplines. One example would be historians of political thought having difficulty grasping the concept from a literary theorist of a multi-generational conversation. Through poetry, let's say, at the Folger one, in one symposium. The literary theorists were talking about how you could look at poems over the course of 150 years as a conversation. The historians in the crowd were, well, what on earth are you talking about? So to bring it home to the digital humanities, the other issue that has yet to be resolved is the limitations of optical character recognition right now and the software data mining promises great potential. For example, right now in the law library, we are digitizing our pre-1923 dictionaries in order to make them publicly available rather than available through a subscription database. But one thing that stymies us and that we've discovered is the industry standard across the board now is to simply scan the materials, turn them into a PDF, run them through OCR software, and then put the results up without correcting any of what are called OCR suspects. So if you want to do real data mining, somebody needs to provide the resources and the time for staff to go in and correct potentially hundreds of thousands of errors in the optical character recognition. We currently have a visiting researcher with us from Purdue, who is a retired lawyer from Alaska, who stumbled into this problem and on his own initiative has started to create fully searchable texts of the Federalist Papers, Blackstone's commentaries, and a handful of Farron's constitutional collection. But the level of work that's involved in that is monumental until academic institutions, these subscription database providers see the value in providing that level of support to finally create those fully searchable texts. Data mining for the pre-20th century researcher is a world full of promise that we're nowhere near achieving yet. So we have a faculty member at the law school, Randy Barnett, who one of his research assistants came our way and was very excited about the dictionary project and suggested to me that Randy had thought, well, if we could just create a digital library of all the founding era documents, then we could data mine it and find that real public original intent. I won't bother with a tangent of all of the complications. I'll summarize it this way. There's no Star Trek style data android in the founding period who could have perceived that data mined original intent. But that's a side issue.
But Scalia knows it.
There are no means capable of doing that. But even if there were, we don't have the digital library that would provide that fully accurate information for such a scholar. So, how could we inspire libraries, academic institutions, and private providers to do that?
Any comments from the floor? Yes.
Well, I do know that somebody got very rich with these CAPTCHAs where, when you're trying to log on to make sure you're not a bot. And they put one that's computer generated, but another piece is from OCR that it couldn't recognize. And then the human recognizes it and then types it in, and they treat that as, they resolve that little piece of unrecognized. Now, maybe some cases they make mistakes and then the human has to look at that. But there's some very clever ways that some of these OCR problems, I don't know if they're making huge headways or not, but they have some very clever ways of kind of like crowdsourcing these problems.
Absolutely. The possibility exists that some very clever software engineer is going to finally develop a piece of OCR software that will resolve these issues. But I don't think we can just twiddle our thumbs waiting for that miraculous technology to come along when we have the capacity to simply sit a staff member or a student worker down with that initial OCR text, comparing it to the scanned images and correcting it.
The Google Print project, which started now almost a decade ago, actually ran into that very same difficulty, and they corrected it when so many scholars said this is junk because you're not actually accurately representing the text. So I would guess Google probably has some such device. I would think it would be mind-numbing for somebody to look and compare, and that would be somewhat difficult to do. But I guess I would say, let's hear it again for libraries. No library that participated in that Google Print project of now millions of volumes ever discarded the actual book, the artifact, because we know that that is still definitive and authentic and authoritative. And any amount of digitization is always going to be fraught with difficulty. It's another reason why we're so intent on preserving special collections, because what is actually authentic in the document, with someone's hand scratching as an annotation or an emendation, is going to be extremely valid. But even if you digitize things, those sorts of things, as you all know, can be manipulated and remanipulated. So back to the concept of truth and authenticity, it is those kinds of things that for the preservation of scholarly communication, I'm on a soapbox, sorry, and for the preservation of culture for generations to come, I think we have to look at those kinds of authentic materials and hope that libraries will continue to have the funding to preserve all of those materials irrespective of the formats in which they originated. So there.
Sorry to join you on your soapbox, but not just to preserve the original artifact, the object, the book, but what are called TIFFs, the most stable
Right,
digital
whatever the
image you can
format
create.
actually, right.
Because a lot of people, private individuals, my visiting researcher from Purdue, just relies on JPEGs or PDFs, and the average person is totally unaware of how lossy those formats are. So we also need to, as we're scanning more and more materials, come up with terabytes upon terabytes of storage space in order to preserve those. So we now need to look towards a future where we not only have adequate rare book vaults that are properly controlled for environment, but digital storage space that's going to preserve that part of it as well.
Just about the time you get that job, you will not be able to read anything that you did. That's what's really good about books, except they fade. You know, like the Constitution, boy, it's hard to read.
So one other thing on digitization, there's a visiting fellow in the economics department who unfortunately is going to go to Duke next year. But it was interesting because we tried to hire him in the School of Foreign Service for a permanent position, jointly with econ, and had problems. This is a guy who works in big data. Really good guy, extraordinary guy. One of these, I think he's a wunderkind, but whatever, whoever he becomes, he's a neat guy. And we tried to hire him. What was interesting to me is I've been on many searches trying to hire people in the data and the sciences and whatnot. And the question would always come up about our facilities, our computer facilities, UIS, technology. And his comment to me was really interesting. And it gets to this question about technology. He said, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, because my data isn't here. I keep my data on a supercomputer that's located a couple thousand miles away. And all I really need is access to that. I do not need to have that on site. And that, to me, was an epiphany. It makes total sense, but it suggests, yes, we need, who was saying, we need terabytes of information. But we don't necessarily need it. What we need is access to that. And that access could be global, although of course the cloud has its own problems because the cloud isn't really a cloud. But nonetheless, that just suggested to me that there are multiple ways to do this. And to me, it also speaks to online learning and all this. It's extraordinary. I see it right now as we're at the wrong end of the cost curve. But developing online learning that actually really works is extraordinarily expensive. And the idea that you could actually do that now and make it profitable is just, I don't see it at all. But I don't think we have to do that. I think we can actually specialize in different ways. So like your people of saying, well, we've got a solution to flatten the curve. The trick is not to assume that because we need big data, we need to buy it, and that just drives us up the cost curve. The trick is actually to think about these collaborative things, realize there are these ways to bend the curve, to build your buses that house the data that aren't here. So we got outbid by Duke, and this guy's going to Duke, so but he didn't leave us because we didn't have sufficient computer technology for what he was doing. And that, to me, was a really important insight, because otherwise you can always play catch-up, but it doesn't have to be, you can really do that in a lot of creative ways.
That's almost an ad for the project that Spiros and I are working on, because the notion about Ostera is that almost nothing resides here at Georgetown. But what resides here at Georgetown points to so that the technology is enabling what you are talking about. You don't have to, big data is not data all in one place.
On your desk.
On your desk, or even at the university, or even in the region. That's exactly correct.
Yes.
But I would add, say, just to go along with Artemis, though, I think the library does need resources, because now libraries will be storing data. And whether the data is here or there, there's a huge industry talk about data conversion, you know, from JPEGs to TIFF. It's getting incredibly complicated, and then also managing security and ownership of data. So it's a very, very crazy world out there that I see. But you know, here in Washington, we have potentially access to incredible data. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission has incredible micro data of, you know, microsecond by microsecond trade data, but it is now under lock and key. So the government has, you know, President Obama signed an open data initiative. Everything is by default open, but in reality, that's just not how it works. And part of it is the lack of resources. You look at Social Security, Department of Labor, they're struggling with the ability to actually manage this data. And so I think there's huge opportunities for libraries to provide the curatorship when it moves into also data librarianship. And the idea of archiving data, I've heard many stories of data on magnetic tapes being thrown away because the people at Social Security just didn't know what to do with it, and throwing away just priceless amounts of data. And this is really a huge area where I think with our location with the federal government, there could be some real gains to working with the federal government to try to curate and work with the dissemination of data that the government
And
has.
provide the access, which is why data services, which are quite distinct from building sites for big data or massive data, become some sort of opportunity for libraries, and in fact our libraries collectively are moving along these ways. Giving access right now is very important, I think, to scholars and researchers, irrespective of where those data reside, as long as they aren't secured, as long as they are, in fact, open from the producers of those data.
And our provost is obviously, you know, being former head of the census, is a deep thinker on these issues too. So I think there's some really incredible opportunities for Georgetown going forward and thinking about all of these things and how to make them work.
So I think, you know, whatever the discipline, I think we would all agree that scholarly communication begins and ends in the library, whatever form that takes. And with that, I think, let me just remind everyone that the video from this event will be posted on the library's website, http://www.georgetown.edu/scholarly communication, and that you can all visit this to see past scholarly communication symposia as well. So I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank the organizers for this very stimulating discussion.
If you haven't signed in, could you do that so we can email you for the next one?